Visual potential is the ability to connect designs of data with commonly recognizable aspects of life by using things like size comparisons, widely recognized symbols and shapes, positionality, repetition, and connecting lines or graphics. By pairing those tactics to match the type of data to be displayed, you're able to create a more understandable and recognizable display. There are 5 different forms of visual potential: appearance, location, number, relationship, and time. In my infographic, I tried to implement different tactics of increasing visual potential for all of my displays. In my relationship display, I used the forms of appearance and relationship to exploit the visual potential. First, I used a t-shirt icon to draw immediate attention to the fact that the display is about clothing. I also used a Sankey style diagram to show the relationship of cost of producing a piece of clothing, and to label that diagram, I used connecting lines with the associated cost to show the relationship. I exploit the potential of using location and size in my locational display showing the top garment exporting countries of 2013 by using a circle that is scaled by size on each country included in the data to show where the country is located and also the degree to which that country exports clothing. In my numbers display that shows Bangladesh's growth in the garment industry, I exploit the visual potential of time by using a filled-in graph that shows the sharp increase of exports over time. I also visualize time in my display on scheduled factory safety improvements, in which you can see time passed represented by the stacked bar graphs, showing the aggregation of issues over a period of time. In my location display, I use red dots to encode my data to show which countries export the most clothing. I also used labels over country, export value, and population, and their relative location to the data to encode those numbers. In my display on the growth of Bangladesh's garment industry, I used common X and Y axis values to encode my information, showing export value in billions over time in years. The distance horizontally and vertically represents the data for value and time passed, respectively. In my display showing the collapses and fires since 2012, I used a few types of encoding. First, I plotted the data points on a grid to measure time and death toll. Within that structure, I also used size to represent the death toll as well. I think another option I could have tried to encode this data would have been to use an icon or object and stack them similar to a bar graph to highlight the extremity of the Rana Plaza collapse, which resulted in the deaths of over 1,100 workers. In my display showing CEO compensation for brands that were producing in the Rana Plaza factory complex when the collapse happened, I used the relative position and labels to encode the data. I also used outlines of the actual CEOs themselves to represent them as individuals. In my display on the cost breakdown of a Bangladesh-produced shirt, I use size to encode the different costs that come with producing a shirt in our current globalized economy. I like using the size with the Sankey design in this particular set of numbers because it draws attention to the large markup on the retailer's end and the tiny sliver of costs that go towards labor. This visual representation is helpful to show that labor and associated costs like workplace safety are not prioritized nearly as much as profit. In my display on scheduled safety improvements, I use color to separate the complete and incomplete issues. I use red to represent the incomplete issues because of the qualities like danger and health associated with the color. I also used connecting lines to draw attention and connect certain annotations about specifically how many issues are still incomplete from the most recent report. I chose this color model because I felt that the different shades of gray and a pop of red was serious yet visually appealing. In the model, red is often used to highlight certain important aspects of the displays. Something else I liked about this color model was the off-white background. In my infographic, I emulated my color model in many different ways. Most apparent is the use of red to highlight important data. For example, I used scaled red dots on the map to show different clothing exporting countries, similar to how a map was encoded in my color model. I also used the darker gray, often in titles and large important text, like my color model. In some displays, like the Sankey diagram in the time display, I used the darker shade of gray to represent other data and separate it from the important pieces of data that are encoded in red. I tried to create the same balance of color, which in my color model is dominated by the background color, and then the use of the other colors is used in about the same amount for text and shapes. The tone of this color set in my infographic, I think, is attention-grabbing and serious, which is the tone that I wanted to convey. The use of red can be analogous to fire or violence, which is related to my topic. I would call the color harmony of my set dual because it contains both gray and red, but I also want to draw attention to the fact that there are many different shades of gray that are used, which alone I think would be called monochromatic. I chose to use the font Kelson Sans, which is a very legible sans serif with mainly horizontal and vertical stroke termination, a consistent stroke weight, and I think it is a font that conveys a serious tone. Um, this font was the most similar to my text model that I could find, as the text model has similar features. I used both precision and identity labels in my infographic. For example, in my information display on scheduled factory improvements, I used precision labels to annotate the percent of unresolved issues out of the total. I also used precision labels in my relationship diagram in the form of dollar amounts per each cost. I use identity labels in a number of spots as well. For example, in my location display, I have an identity label pointing towards the point on the map where Bangladesh is located to clarify for readers who do not already know. I use text annotations in a few of my displays, specifically my displays on factory collapses and fires and my display on scheduled factory improvements. In my display on factory disasters, I use a text annotation to provide context on my last data point, which is 0, but had the potential to be more disastrous than Rana Plaza, which is the largest data point on that display. So I felt that it was necessary to use a text annotation to point that out. In my display on factory improvements, I used annotations to clarify what issues are and also to further explain where the data comes from and how it was aggregated. I mainly use thin lines in close proximity to associate my labels with graphic elements. I also make use of alignment to make sure that labels are understandable and consistent. I think that one of the areas in which I could have spent more time on my infographic is the visual hierarchy. I mainly relied on the model layout that I chose to emulate to do this. The hierarchy in my infographic that I tried to instill is very simple. I view the order of viewing as left to right and top to bottom, as if the entire design of my infographic were 2 pages of a magazine. I ordered my displays in a way that I believe would be best for the reader to understand the issues presented, by first showing Bangladesh's historical place in the world's economy as a clothing producer, then showing the commonality of tragic and preventable work-related deaths. I then draw the viewer to think about people who are on the opposite end of the supply chain and their comparative lifestyles. I then show why this difference may be by providing information on what costs go into a piece of clothing that could be purchased by someone in the United States. Finally, I leave the reader with some sense of hope that steps are being taken to improve these conditions. However, there is still urgency in the improvements because they are slow and behind schedule, putting workers at risk every day. I think a way in which I could have improved my visual hierarchy would have been to size my displays differently, drawing more attention to the displays that I think are more important. I also want to point out an aspect that I added to my infographic as a last-minute decision, which is the background texture design. Based off of the visual language model that I chose, which has the texture of cracked earth, like really lightly overlaid on the background, I thought it would make sense to do this with mine as well. I found a 3D model of a fire escape, and I used this very opaquely as a repeated pattern on the background of my entire infographic. Although it may go unnoticed, I think it's very central to the issues that I present. I think that emulating models while designing this infographic really helped me to create unity and variety within my final design. I think that my colors and text help unify the design, as red is somewhat evenly dispersed throughout the design, and my titles for displays are similar in size and style. I think that my shapes and visual graphics demonstrate variety and help make the overall design more appealing and easier to take in. This can be seen in the many different shapes, especially those that are representative of a real-life object, like the fire extinguisher, map, icons, portrait outlines, and t-shirt. All of these designs are somewhat similar in visual language because they were all flat and not very detailed. Although they're not the same, because they create an appearance association, they work largely to create unity. I see this as similar to how unity and variety are used in my visual language model, in which there is a scattering of appearance displays that are recognizable, like the cloud and raindrops, maps, and people. The model also has a consistent and balanced use of color and repeated shapes, similar to my final design. The layout model that I chose to emulate for my infographic is landscape in style, and it's separated into about 6 somewhat equal rectangular sections. My design differs from the layout model quite a bit, as the model uses more colors and exact alignments to group and separate different sections. My displays are a little less coordinated to emulate this type of separation, but I did try to make use of the alignment and separation based on the most prominent vertical and horizontal lines of my layout model. I mainly use titles of displays and the axes of certain displays to create separation via a straight line. I tried to use my layout model's alignment as a guide of my final design. This includes a vertical split, a little left of the middle, and two horizontal splits, one of them about a fourth from the top and another about 2/3 from the top. These sections fit my displays pretty well, but I did end up moving a lot of pieces around of each display in order to create better alignment within my final design. Some important aspects I used for vertical alignment are the right edge of the numbers graph showing the growth in clothing exports over time in Bangladesh, um, and the aligned text on the bottom right-hand display. For horizontal alignment, I mainly use the titles of my display plus some space to create the appearance of separated and aligned sections. More in depth, I mainly used right side text alignment for any text over one line. I also generally tried to align smaller aspects of each display with other aspects in the display to make a coherent overall design. I think that the alignment in my layout model is much more pronounced and defined because there are more right angles of shapes and text blocks to work with, as well as actual lines separating sections. But overall, I used approximately the same sections defined by my layout model for each of my displays.